Hi, everyone, and welcome to Homo Ludens, the channel on history and board games. Super excited to have you all tonight, and I hope that you have your design thinking caps on, because today's stream is promising to be quite interesting. At least I hope so, because it's not every day that we get the chance to interact with people who have significantly shaped the historical board gaming landscape. Today we're joined by Jason Matthews, one of the two minds behind Twilight Struggle, a game that has been a staple of our hobby and beyond, as it has been #1 on BGG for quite a few years. But I won't go easy on him. I'm intending on grilling him about the ins and outs of his designs, but also their impact, and more importantly, what's next for him within the Twilight Struggle series. And Jason Matthews will not be on his own. He's actually joined by Jason Carr, who's the director of development from GMT Games. His role has been quite instrumental, I would say, in the execution of a lot of the latest release by GMT. And beyond that, Jason also has been really important in making sure that so many of the new games released by GMT contain solo bots, thanks to the initiative called GMT1 that is dedicated to making those modules for a lot of the games released by that publisher. He will also be on the hot seat because he's co-designing the future game in the Twilight Struggle series. And the idea of talking about it as a series is a bit odd because it has been a single game for so many years. But quite recently, GMT released a first smaller box, Twilight Struggle Red Sea. That was a game that streamlines the tension of the original classic into a tighter and more digestible playtime package. And we know that has been announced that following that, we'll be shifting our attention to having a bit of a sneak peek into the next one, South Asian Monsoon. But I also want to talk to both Jason Carr and Matthews about what's the future of the series, where the series comes from, what's the idea behind it, and what can we expect going forward. So that's it for the context for tonight. I can see that there is already quite a few of you in the chat and posting some comments. So hi to everyone. Super happy to see all of you here. And I'm going to bring in our guests, Jason Carr and Jason Matthews. Hey, how are you guys doing?
Good. How are you, Fred?
I'm doing well. I'm pretty happy to have both of you here. I think that Jason Matthews, you've been here quite a few times. It's been a while, but you've been here quite a few times. I think it's really Jason Carr that I struggle to get on the show most of the time. He always promises, and then he never delivers. And sometimes I see him on other channels, other YouTube channels that I would say are not as good as this one. And I'm like, why is he losing his time? You know, like the player aids or stuff like this, like small channels, not really a lot of interesting insights. And I'm like, why are you like this, Jason? Why? So I'm happy that you, in a way, went back home, and now it feels like you know where you belong, and I'm happy with that. No, but it's really great to have both of you. And as I said in the introduction, I'm quite excited to see Twilight Struggle being expanded as a series, because I think it was the case for quite a lot of people. For me, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Twilight Struggle. Twilight Struggle was my first historical board game, the first time that I realized that games could do what they do, and it actually sparked like an interest for me that was massive. So I think it's really interesting to see this taking this turn. Maybe before we start, I will have a quick note for everyone who's watching us live, but also the people who are watching us after the fact. If you're watching us live, please feel free to ask some questions in the chat. If I don't pick up your question straight away, don't worry. It's just probably that I think that there is a better moment for me to bring your question up. So don't be sad if it takes a bit. And the other thing that I want you to remember is that if you want to support what I do here, well, first thing that you can do is subscribe, but also what you can do is support the show on Ko-fi, and that will give you access to an amazing Discord server. And I'm saying this, and I probably didn't add the Ko-fi link in the description, so it's going to be your first adventure. You're going to have to find out where do you find this Ko-fi link to actually give yourself money. So that should be fun. But I see quite a few of you here, and I guess let's jump into it, and let's start asking some questions. I would like to maybe start with you, Jason Matthews. I have to specify because two Jasons is not making the interview easy. And my first question for you was, so Twilight Struggle has had a huge impact on the world of board games since it was first released. how does it feel to know that you've created something that is loved by so many players and that has been so influential to new players, but also designers? Does it feel overwhelming? Is it like exciting, or you feel like it's a burden? I was curious about that.
Well, it's certainly not a burden, and it is kind of a shock because as I always say in interviews, Ananda and I were designing for ourselves, and what we were trying to accomplish with Twilight Struggle was really to move card-driven games back in a direction that corresponded with our lifestyle and our capacity to play and the amount of time we had to play. Even though Twilight Struggle is considered sort of a long game in contemporary standards, at the time we designed it, things were drifting off into 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 hours. And so Twilight Struggle seemed like a considerable shortening of the playtime. And so to have so many people appreciate it, it's kind of stunning. I just came back from Mexico City, where they had a very nice, an extremely fine convention. And I was floored by the number of people who had played or heard of Twilight Struggle. I didn't really think that it would be a big deal in Mexico, but it turned out to be, at least with the people at the convention.
And like, since it was released in 2005, what was the biggest surprise for you of seeing the kind of impact that the game had?
Well, a couple of months ago, I got photos from 2 players in Iran, and that was kind of breathtaking in terms of how broad the scope was and how many people have now been exposed to the game.
It's interesting that you mentioned Iran, because on Sunday we actually had a live stream to play Dan Bullock's 1979 Revolution in Iran, and actually one of the viewers was watching us from Iran and was talking about the fact that they were super interested in those kind of games, that they were hard to get access to in Iran because most of the publishers are from the US, and you have those restrictions that makes it hard for them to have access to those games. So I'm saying it here. I don't know what we can do, but if there is anything we can do to support the development of our wargaming community in Iran, I'm more than happy to support. I'm not in the US, so maybe that can help. I'm not sure. But yeah, if there is anything we can do, just reach out. I'm more than happy to be supportive of anyone who's interested in developing historical board gaming into their own country. But now going to you, Jason Carr. That's the Jason that I'm interested in now. So Jason, you've been mostly super active on the development side of GMT, and we haven't seen you that much on the design side. I've known you for quite a few years now. I know that you work on quite a different things, but those are all in the background. And finally, you make your entrance in as a designer, working on probably one of the biggest game that was released in the history of historical board gaming. How do you feel about taking part in that, building that legacy? Is it a bit stressful? Do you feel like there is a lot of pressure on your shoulder? Is it exciting? A bit of both? How do you approach it?
Yeah, that's a fun question. It is like a little bit of pressure to not screw up because it is Twilight Struggle, but one of the really cool things about that has been being able to work with Jason on the games. When we worked on Red Sea, I came in pretty late and was, not doing design. I was just doing development. But as we got into it and started pushing ideas back and forth, it became pretty clear that the two of us can slide back and forth between design and development. And I think that's going to work really well for the series, because for South Asian Monsoon, Jason's been driving a lot of the ideas. And my role has been to be the wall that things get bounced off of. But as we look forward in the series, that's definitely going to flip around. And that takes a lot of the pressure off, because I know that I have support from Jason and what I'm doing, and he has support in me for what he's doing. And that makes it a really collaborative environment, which is great.
Okay, and you hinted a bit about the future. Can we talk maybe and we'll probably talk a bit more further during the interview, but what's the future after Monsoon, and what role you're going to take in that potential future entry?
Yeah, I think I'll jump on that one. So our next kind of game in the series after South Asian Monsoon is going to be on the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I worked with Harold Buchanan on Flashpoint South China Sea, and when I was working on that, I got this idea to port that system to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And as I was working on it, I kept running into these design problems and trying to come up with solutions. And most of them had to do with how do you evoke Cold War tension. And I was pretty stuck on it. And Bruce Mansfield, who's one of the designers at GMT, he designed Gandhi for the coin series. He mentioned to me that I just needed to come up with something that was evocative the way Twilight Struggle was. And I kind of said, wait a second, why don't I just use Twilight Struggle? So after working with Jason on the previous game, Red Sea, I was like, well, wait a second, this could work. And so I typed up a summary of kind of what I was thinking and sent it to him. And I think his reply, the first sentence was like, I'm all in on this. And so that was really encouraging and really gave me confidence to move forward. And, you know, you hinted a little bit that Red Sea has changed some things and South Asian Monsoon is going to change some things. Cuban Missile Crisis is a little bit more of a departure from the traditional gameplay, where I'm trying to completely move it away from the domino theory aspect of Twilight Struggle and just focus very heavily on the secrecy elements that played in the Cold War. So the US intelligence apparatus versus the Soviet doctrine of Maskarovka and how they tried to hide what they were doing and mislead Western agencies. And so that's what that game's really focused on. And that's how I'm, you know, kind of thinking about my chapter in the saga.
Okay, but that sounds super interesting and something that I definitely want to come back to on how does each game is going to approach the Cold War from a different perspective and potentially show different things that as a whole Twilight Struggle couldn't cover. So that's something that I'm going to be interested in. But before we talk about this, just maybe one last question about the series as a whole. So, and that's a question that comes from Stuart. He asked that question on the Discord server before we started the stream. And his question was, Twilight Struggle has been around for quite a while. And has it always been a long-term plan to make it a series, or did something specific trigger that will to make a series of smaller games in the recent years? Because there was quite a gap, like I think 17 years between the first game and the actual first iteration within the series. What happened?
I mean, it would be. It's not entirely a lie to say that I work very slowly, so there's that reality. But in addition, there had been kind of a prompt in that a lot of people will design kind of variant cards for GMT and submit them. And GMT got a deck. This kind of happened right before COVID, actually. And they sent it, they were like, we'd like to do this. And they sent it over to me. And I took a look at it, and it was very clear right from just a casual reading that the cards had not been play tested and that a lot of them would warp the game in ways that competitive players would not appreciate. So I said, well, I don't think this is a great idea, but if there is this clamoring inside GMT to do something more with Twilight Struggle, let me take a whirl at it. And my initial thought was, well, I'll just come up with a deck of some things that I think should have been in Twilight Struggle but weren't. And the Horn of Africa was one of those things. And then it just evolved into this notion that there were a lot of things about Twilight Struggle that could be addressed, one of which was we don't have a great on-ramp for the system. So that's kind of how Red Sea developed. And
you're touching upon a topic that I wanted to cover, and you're talking about the competitive players. So that's one thing that is quite specific with Twilight Struggle that I also discovered later. So first I discovered Twilight Struggle, I started playing it, and then I'm looking for playing it online. And then I discovered that there is this community of really hardcore players that are not necessarily that much interested about the history for some of them, but really focus on more the competitive aspect of the game. And I was wondering, when you designed this game with Ananda, was it something that you expected, that the game became such a staple in competitive board gaming, or was it a surprise?
It wasn't entirely a surprise because some of the early playtesters were sort of CDG sharks. And, back before we had a lot of online competition and options for online competition, these were mostly players at the World Board Game Championships, which is not too far from where I live in the DC area. Anyway, so a couple of those sharks said up front, this game is going to be fantastic for competitive play because it so easily weeds out inexperienced players from experienced players, and it'll be fantastic for WBC competitions. So I'm not surprised that it has a competitive element, that it has become this global thing where, there's an annual international cup. That took me by surprise.
And maybe that's a trickier question here. And I'm wondering, do you think that the fact that the game became that competitive and that important for a competitive community, in a way, it constrained the fact that it could be developed as a series? Like it was hard to expand upon. And in a way, the fact that you're coming up with those mini games is like a way out. Is this what's happening?
It is absolutely true that the people in competitive league tend to approach Twilight Struggle, and I don't want to put words in their mouth, but they're sort of like, it's perfect, don't change anything. And I do think mini games are a way to offer people who are looking to vary the experience a little more or wanted to explore the history in different ways. We can satisfy them at the same time, not messing with the game that competitive players love.
Yeah, that's interesting. And Jason, I was seeing you nodding. What's your perspective from on that point?
Yeah, that's really interesting because Jason and I have been talking a lot about what we want South Asian Monsoon to play like. And with Red Sea, that was explicitly designed as an introductory game. And so one of the things about it is there's no reshuffle. And taking the reshuffle out of the game means that a lot of the card play that Twilight Struggle players like, competitive Twilight Struggle players like, where they play cards for future considerations to get them out of the deck or to keep them in the deck. That isn't really present in Red Sea unless you're playing the 3-turn variant. And that means that the audience for the game shifted pretty significantly. With South Asian Monsoon, we're actually kind of leaning the other direction and trying to design something that has a lot of the things that people like about Twilight Struggle on steroids. And so whether that will appeal to a competitive player or not, I guess we'll find out. But with the Cuban Missile Crisis game as well, like that game leans into the card knowledge aspects of Twilight Struggle to some degree. Like a lot of the cards in that game are interrelated in ways that will change the later course of the game, depending on what you choose to do or not do in the first turn. And that's very intentional. It's very much an attempt to appeal to the aspects of the game that have made people play it over and over and over again for 15 plus years.
Okay, so you're not totally moving away from the competitive aspect. You're just trying to broaden the audience and maybe offer different kinds of experiences around the game. That's quite interesting. Then my first question would come like when I'm looking at it as a series of small game. Why did you start with this one, Red Sea? What was the intent? What made the topic so attractive, and what was the intent of that specific design? And as you said, to make something that is a bit more introductory. What was the motivation behind it?
So I'd known for a long time, it had occurred to me for quite some time that there had been this element of the Cold War that we just totally did not represent in Twilight Struggle. And it was important enough that it deserved at least a cards acknowledgement. And in a couple of the expansions that we've done, I'd suggested a card for East Africa that worked a little bit like Southeast Asia, in that it'd be like a one-time scoring card that you played once and forgot about, because that seemed to fit the model. But the truth is, when I started digging through the history, it's such a bizarre incident in the Cold War that I thought it kind of deserves a game. The Ethiopians had been American allies since basically the end of World War II. So 30 years of stable alliance with the Ethiopians. Ethiopia goes through a series of famines, and in the penultimate one, the one before the most famous, Haile Selassie, who had been emperor of Ethiopia, didn't handle it very well, as old kings tend not to handle things very well. He has a Marxist revolution, and the Ethiopian government gets tossed, and the Soviets, in kind of classical Cold War cynicism, think, hey, Ethiopia is a bigger country, we should go ally ourselves with that. But their traditional ally for about a decade had been Somalia. And the Somalis are like, oh, no, you can't align yourself with the Ethiopians. We're just about to invade. And they invade anyway. And while all of this is happening, the Somalis come to Washington and they're like, hey, we're kind of free actors here now. And the Soviets are all cozy with the Marxists in Ethiopia. Maybe we should be friends. And so in like the span of 6 months, 2 Cold War satellite countries switch sides. And in that process, all sorts of bizarreness happens because the Romanians, who had good relations with the Somalis, remain Somali allies. And the Israelis, who'd been training the Ethiopian army for decades, remain Ethiopian allies. So the Soviet Union, Ethiopia, and Israel are allied in this conflict against Somalia, Romania, and the United States. So it's just a bizarre mess that deserved to be kind of highlighted.
And that's interesting, the fact that you're mentioning that in your original game there were some blind spots that you were not covering in the Cold War. And I'm thinking, well, you probably continue to read a lot of books about the Cold War since 2015 and everything. And I was wondering, did your perspective change on a lot of those events? And if so, do you think that you would make Twilight Struggle differently if you made it today?
No, because we knew a lot of things were wrong about Twilight Struggle when we designed Twilight Struggle, but we were trying to capture the feel of the protagonists. So it doesn't matter that the domino theory is not real. We all know it's not real. There were studies during the Cold War that said this is made up. But if you were a decision maker in Washington, you behaved as if it was real. And so to a certain extent, it doesn't matter that political scientists can prove you wrong after the fact. It's kind of that motivation of your decision making that we're trying to capture.
So in a way, Twilight Struggle was more a simulation to a very hawkish psyche that was in Washington at that time, more than an actual historical representation.
Yes, that's the truth. And I do think that Mania seems to have captured Washington and Moscow equally.
Yeah. Okay, but that's I think really an interesting point. Maybe now back to the design itself. Twilight Struggle has a very distinct narrative. Like you really have those 3 phases of the war, and each subsection of the deck actually bring us events that are helping build that narrative. Do you feel like making games that are smaller in terms of scales, both in terms of time, but also geographically, comes at the expense of those narrative arcs that you had in the original game?
To an extent. It's very hard to be grandiose when you're talking about small countries, small unstable countries whose participation in the Cold War is not as dramatic or as extensive as places in Europe or Asia. But with the situation with South Asian Monsoon, I kind of have found that I have the opposite problem dealing with South Asia, because there are so many important Cold War figures there, Nehru, Indira Gandhi, obviously Khrushchev and Mao and the rest, that get kind of short shrift in the original Twilight Struggle, that I had a deck probably twice as long as I really needed or wanted. And I just spent a better part of a month trying to figure out what I was going to toss out. So for Red Sea, yes. For South Asian Monsoon, I think I've had the opposite issue.
And I guess this is where Jason Carr comes in also, like when it comes
Yes.
to like cutting stuff.
You can just refer to him as the wall because that is his.
And then my question is, Jason, how do you do this balance? Because you want also to create a narrative arc within a small game, which is quite tricky because you don't have the length of Twilight Struggle. So how do you make those decisions to what you keep, what you cut, and how do you balance the whole thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's done in a couple different ways. One of the ways is Jason and I have to be on the same page as what the story we're telling is. And so to some degree, we've read some of the same books to get there. Like we both read Robert McMahon's Cold War on the Periphery, which is a good resource for like a general overview for the period and what's going on. And that has helped us anchor the narrative on what are India and Pakistan doing and how are the United States and Soviet Union relating to India and Pakistan. And then, there's other narrative elements that are really important. The non-aligned movement is one of them. The political maneuvering in China to be the successor to Mao Zedong is another one. And so there's a number of beats that are critical. And anytime one of us wants to do something to the game that would detract from those narrative elements, the other person's going to call them out. So that's one of the ways that this happens. I think the other major way is with anytime you're designing event cards, you want to get creative and clever and show players things that they've never seen before. And that can have side effects. And so Jason will come up with a list of cards that are just, he's throwing ideas out there and seeing what works. And my job when he does that is to come back and say, hey, have you thought about how this might work? Or have you thought about how that might work? And sometimes I'll point a card out and he'll say, oh yeah, no, it'll be fine. And then he'll go do a play test and come back and say, so you were right about that card. Other times I'll say this card's not going to work and he'll go test it and say, no, actually it's fine. So one of those happened with his most recent testing at CircleCon, I think. And we are just going to constantly manipulate and change the deck, and coming up with creative card effects is probably the hardest part of the design, something that evokes the history of the card, because nobody likes to play a game where it's like, you get Indira Gandhi as a card and that just adds 2 influence to India. Like that's not an interesting card. But at the same time, those cards have to be within the bounds of the way the system works. And to Jason's point about kind of a lot of the fan cards that are out there, sometimes they're really interesting and very cool, but a lot of times they miss the way that the system plays within its own boundaries, and they do things that just fundamentally break the system. So that's a big tension, the creativity versus what the system can actually handle. And that's why having a co-designer is super helpful.
And you started touching a bit upon it, talking about the books that you read, the fact that you're reading books that are more or less the same, and then talking about, okay, how can we implement those different events? How do you approach research when the border between being a developer and a designer becomes really blurry? What do you do? Do you share reading lists? Do you have a book club? Like, how do you approach this? I'd like to have your perspective, Jason Carr, first.
Yeah, so with this particular design, since we're both listed as designers, the whole blurry developer designer thing doesn't matter. But what does matter is making sure that we're reading at least some of the same material. And so this book was actually Jason's suggestion as a good starting point. For me, I like to go to Wikipedia and find the secondary sources that are listed. You can tell I was a history major because I go read the footnotes and then that tells me what to read. But we spend I spend a good amount of time just reading articles and journals and books. And then we had an email thread that went on for months where we were just going back and forth on, how do you want to represent this? How do you think about that? What about this? And a lot of ideas there that got thrown out. I was looking at that thread the other day, and some of the ideas there were insanity. But other things that we thought were really crazy, we've ended up using. So I think that's kind of how it's more of an exchange of ideas and less trying to be in lockstep. And by exchanging ideas back and forth, we got a sense of, okay, we want this to be a little bit more grounded. We want it to reflect a little bit more of the geopolitical reality. We can't escape the fact that the decision makers in Washington and Moscow at that time definitely at least justified their actions using things like domino theory that we have to take into account to get the feel right. So yeah, I think that that's how we settled on it, much more than, hey, let's read this together and compare notes.
And now that we're on the topic of research, if you were to recommend just a couple of books for each of those 3 first games that are going to be released, because I think that was one of question from Sam Speck, because like you mentioned the fact that there was quite a few books and everything. So if we start with Red Sea, and the question goes for both of you, like if there were 1 or 2 books you would recommend to get into it, what would those be?
Oh, God, where's my Red Sea books? Are off my shelf. I got a reading stack right over here that had all of my Red Sea stuff, but I moved it away because I'm done reading it. There is, I'll see if I can find it. There is an extraordinarily interesting book that is terrifyingly badly written. It reads like a State Department memo, but it is just the internal NSC considerations between the State Department, the NSC, and the Department of Defense during the entirety of the Ogaden War and the conflict between Somalia and Ethiopia. And it's an amazing insight on the ugly politics between the American bureaucratic infrastructure about how they viewed these events very differently. And then Carter sitting on top of it without really knowing very much about foreign policy, having only been the governor of Georgia prior to this.
And what's the title of the book?
So that's what I can't remember. I'll see if I can find it. So I don't know where I put it, unfortunately.
But then I will ask to Jason for South Asian Monsoon and the Cuban Missile Crisis while Jason figures out the title of the book.
Yeah. So before we jump off Red Sea, I have a couple book suggestions there. One is Wings Over Ogaden, which really focuses on the Air Forces of both, but it gives a good overview of what happened. And you'll notice there's cards in Red Sea that are specifically related to the Air Forces. So those are really interesting. I also really like the book, The Ethiopian Revolution, War in the Horn of Africa. That book was really helpful for me. So those would be my 2 recommendations for Red Sea. Both are very focused on the 2 client states, because that was kind of where the actual fighting was.
I don't know why I forgot this. It's called Buried in the Sands of the Ogaden. And that phrase is actually what Zbigniew Brzezinski kind of snarkily responded, what happened to the SALT II treaty? And he said, it's buried in the sands of the Ogaden. That's the title of that book.
It's very poetic. Like it.
There's a great history that came out from the Wilson Center from the Soviet archives, just talking about what the Soviet Union perspective on this conflict was as well. And the archives book definitely gives you the impression that the Soviets were just kind of stumbling, as with a lot of things that happened during the Cold War, because the events were unexpected. They didn't have a plan. They just kind of went with the path of least resistance, which is also why I always say that the truest game of Twilight Struggle that you will ever play is the first one, where you don't know any of the events and you just make stupid errors, because that's what people.
That's what happened. Yeah. That's quite interesting. And now if we go to Monsoon, so what would be a couple of books that you could recommend?
Yeah, I got 2 for you that I think are really, really good. I previously mentioned Cold War on the Periphery. This is probably the best single volume you're going to get that is an overview of the whole period. And it goes from, it starts with in 1947 with partition, and then it ends in 1965, I think, with the Indo-Pakistani War. And so I really recommend that book, and it has an incredible bibliography at the back if you want to read more. The other book that I really like is called Fateful Triangle, which is about the relationship between China, India, and the United States, and how China changed the United States foreign policy toward India, which it was very dynamic during the time. So there's a lot of really interesting bits in that book. So those would be my recommendations there. For Cuban Missile Crisis, again, 2 books for you. One of them is Michael Dobbs, 1 Minute to Midnight. So if you don't know who Michael Dobbs is, he's I think he was a New York Times reporter, or Washington Post, excuse me, Washington Post reporter. And this book, he did a bunch of original research for. And some of the research here was new to veterans of the conflict itself. So, for example, he was the first person to talk about the fact that the Soviet Union had deployed Luna missiles to guard the beaches against a potential invasion. And so really interesting stuff in here. And this is, again, just a phenomenal 1-volume US perspective on the Cuban Missile Crisis. For the Soviet perspective, I really recommend the book Nuclear Folly, A History of the Cuban Missile Crisis by Serhiy Plokhy. This author had access to the Soviet archives, and he tells the story from the Khrushchev perspective. These two books complement each other so well because Dobbs makes a lot of conjecture about how Khrushchev was thinking that is then specifically carried out, brought through by looking in the Soviet archives. Obviously, you can read Khrushchev on Khrushchev. That's a great resource. You should absolutely read 13 Days, even though it's basically fiction. But it's, again, a really good resource to learn about how people felt in the XCOM and what was actually going on there.
Well-written fiction also. It's a breezy read.
Very well written.
Yeah. And now that we're on the topic of 13 Days, so there was the original small CDG on the Cuban Missile Crisis called 13 Days, which I think we both love. And Jason, I don't know how you feel about it, but I know that for me, it was the first time that I realized that CDGs could be on a smaller scale. And I think it was the first pass to my journey to actually make Red Flag over Paris. So it was also highly influential. What made you feel, Jason, that that there was room for another game on the same topic, but like pretty similar, because in a lot of ways, 13 Days is a mini Twilight Struggle, and you're taking the Twilight Struggle system to do a mini Cuban Missile Crisis. So what's the idea here?
Yeah, I thought that 13 Days was really fun, and I probably played that game 100 times. So, obviously I have it sitting right here. Just been thinking about getting it back out to kind of refresh myself on it now that the bulk of my design is done. But when I was originally thinking about doing a Cuban Missile Crisis game, there were a couple things that I felt were possibilities to explore that weren't really touched on by the 13 Days. One of them was that aspect of secrecy and intelligence. And in 13 Days, secrecy is presented simply through hidden agendas. And to be honest, I don't like those. That's not a game design thing that I enjoy very much. And so in Cuban Missile Crisis, Twilight Struggle Cuban Missile Crisis, I'm trying to move, there won't be hidden agendas. I'm trying to model the thinking of Khrushchev and Kennedy in the things that players actually have to do. And so I felt that was one thing that was missing. Another one was that the time delay between Moscow and the Caribbean was a significant factor in the decision-making that went into the Cuban Missile Crisis. So for those who don't know who Vasily Arkhipov is, you should go look him up. He was a flotilla commander for the Soviet submarine fleet that was deployed to support the missile shipping operations to Cuba. And that man probably stopped a nuclear exchange because he refused to allow a nuclear torpedo to be launched. And if you look at the reasons why why the captain of that ship wanted to launch that torpedo, a lot of them come back to the fact that Moscow could not easily communicate with their forces in that region. And 13 Days doesn't function at a scale where that's a significant component of how the game works. So I want to explore a little bit more of why was it that these decisions got made at a tactical level and really zoom into just what was going on in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the game's theaters are a little bit different. Instead of looking globally and kind of being, I think 13 Days is a little bit more of here's the Cold War through the lens of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
My game is very much focused on the Cuban Missile Crisis itself. And so we're going to look at the UN Security Council specifically and the countries that are in there specifically and how were they aligned together and with the superpowers. And then obviously Berlin has to play in any conversation of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Khrushchev called it the testicles of the West. So that was a pretty big important thing for us to talk about. And then the other thing is the actual quarantine, the actual shipping of the missiles, and the game that was played to try to hide them at first, and then the bluffing that went into Khrushchev knowing that we knew, but we hadn't said that we knew, and the communication back and forth between Kennedy and Khrushchev on that is really interesting. So those are the things I want to touch on that 13 Days doesn't cover, and the reason why I think there's space for another game.
Okay, but that's super interesting, and I think it shows also really well the different approaches that are going to be in there. I'm going to ask a lighter question now, because I think it could be a good transition towards something else. And I'm going to take the question from Nicholas Tyson here in the chat, who's asking. So genuine question. Apologies if it's too frivolous. It is very frivolous, Nicholas, and you should be ashamed. We don't accept frivolity on this channel. So. How dare you? But do any of you have a favorite Twilight Struggle card? Not in terms of strongest, but just the coolest card. I already have one card in mind, but I think we can start with you, Jason Matthews.
I really love when I get de-Stalinization in my hand, because I love to pop influence over into South America way before the Americans are ready for it to be there. So I think that, and in terms of the card effect, I very much appreciate the impact that War Games has on the overall play of Twilight Struggle.
Nice. And you, Jason Carr, what's your favorite Twilight Struggle card?
I think thematically, it's got to be what is it called? U2 Incident, I think is what it's called. I've always been fascinated by the. First of all, that card's ambiguous. I don't know which incidents it's referring to, because there were two nearly simultaneous U2 incidents during the Cuban Missile Crisis. One accidental overfly of the Soviet Union, and then a U2 that was shot down. And then it could have been Gary Powers' U2 that it's referring to. So but thematically, I'm just so interested in like the way the United States used the U2 as a bargaining chip, as a threat, as an actual source of intelligence. But I think mechanically, Kitchen Debates is probably my favorite, because how often do you get a card that lets you, physically assault an opponent? Like, pretty rare.
That's really true.
Not often enough is the
yes,
answer.
definitely. Yeah. Sometimes when I play against Joe Dewhurst, I would like a card that lets me slap him in the face. That's for sure. Like, I would love that. I think my favorite card, and it's interesting that you talk about the fact that the game represents the perspective from the actors of the era and not the reality, because my favorite card in Twilight Struggle is the Gaulle card, which I think is nuts. Like what it does mechanically is insane, because it's like it depicts the Gaulle as this crazy leftist, and like I'm French, like, and for us, the Gaulle was basically a general who took power. Almost, it was a semi-coup d'etat, like it was pretty right wing, and he actually took power thanks to pretty far right generals in Nigeria. He betrayed them, obviously, and he ended up installing a very special kind of republic, very authoritative, but still, the fact that in the game it is represented as someone who's going a bit like rogue with the commies, and it's like I find it a bit funky. I always loved and was also a bit made uncomfortable about that card, but I think that the discussion that we had today probably clarifies some of this.
Indeed. It was an issue about how do you represent countries trying to assert their independence in the Cold War. And so there are the same issue is a little bit present on the side of the Warsaw Pact, but I am still an American, so anything we can do to tweak our French allies always makes American players happy.
Yeah, fair enough. But it is from French perspective. I think it's always been a card that, I think makes French player either laugh or cringe. But I find it quite funny. But that's but the reason I thought it was a good question to ask is because I'm also curious about what's coming up next. And what is interesting about those cards is that it gives you the ability to focus the spotlight on something very specific. And I was wondering, how did this change when you were focusing really on smaller scale conflict? Did it change the type of actors that you're representing in the deck? Were you able to represent things that are not easy to represent on a wider scale? How did it shift what a card represents in those new designs? And which one of you want to take it? Jason Matthews, let's hear. Yeah.
One thing for sure that I relatively scrupulously ignored in Twilight Struggle was the actions of our allies. France and the United Kingdom did not cease becoming global actors just because the Cold War was going on, but we tried very conspicuously to pretend that was not true in Twilight Struggle. When you start drilling down a little more into these other regions, it becomes impossible to ignore colonialism and its impact and those relationships. And so there's in Red Sea about the French relationships with their former colonies in East Africa. There's additional nods to it in South Asian Monsoon, where we're dealing with the Commonwealth and India and Ceylon, Sri Lanka, as well as a number of those smaller countries, island countries that are still colonial possessions at the beginning of the game. And so part of the narrative of South Asian Monsoon is that decolonization process.
Okay, but that's interesting. Do you want to build up on that, Jason, or yeah?
Yeah, I think that there's the opportunity to present personalities that maybe had a regional impact but didn't have a global impact, and presenting, like in the Cuban Missile Crisis, Castro is a different level of involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis than he is in global politics. He's always there, but I think that it also, to Jason's point, gives an opportunity to really speak about what did world leaders think of the agency of a country like Cuba, or the agency of a country like the United Kingdom in the in the global events that were happening. And so during the crisis itself, how much did Kennedy actually spend time consulting with allies? Not very much. What were their roles? They were to be persuaded. And when you look at the UN Security Council and you see the arguments that were happening there, and you see the countries that were involved, we don't talk about Ireland very often when we talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis, but they were on the Security Council at that time, and they did matter. And they mattered, though, in a specific lens and in a specific way. And so I think that gives us an opportunity to start to speak about agency and foreign policy and what was going on with decolonization at that time, and the ways that things did change and the way that things didn't change. And so that's a little bit of the subtext to the game that we wouldn't be able to capture at a global strategic level that you can when you zoom in on a specific conflict or region.
Will this be the first time that Ireland is actually a game in Twilight Struggle?
Yeah, I mean, they've got space for influence. Let's go.
And maybe to start to get to reach to a conclusion. So Twilight Struggle Red Sea was released late last year or early this year. I don't remember. You're going to have South Asian Monsoon that is going to be released, I guess, quite soon. Do you have any estimation for this one? Is it later this year or early next?
It'll be next year.
Yeah, next year. And then,
just given the backlog, I don't think anything else is really possible.
Yeah, sure. And then you're going to have the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's probably going to be added to P500 in some months from now. But I guess, and beyond that, do you already have like an overarching vision for what you want the series to be? Do you have like specific events that you're excited about? Are you thinking about opening the series to other designers to see what they would come up with, and just having like maybe the two of you overarching the development of the series? How are you thinking about the development of the Twilight Struggle extended universe, you could say?
I can't speak for Jason here, but I really want to get one of those Volco gigs where I just sit on Discord and have people design my games.
But that's the dream. We all hope to reach that point, and just get the cut of the royalties. It's like so that's what you're aiming for. You want to have your horde of young designers making games in the Twilight Struggle series.
Precisely.
That's the plan.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm totally open to people who are interested in designing in that series, and I should have said that the designers of 13 Days are Danes and they were very politely approached me about, oh, can we do this game using your system? And I was like, yeah, absolutely. Not only did I say absolutely, I found them a publisher. So I'm more than thrilled to have people who like the system, are interested in the system, but want to tell some Cold War story that we haven't gotten around to.
Good. I guess that's also a call for people who are watching us. If you have an idea, instead of before calling you. That's the thing, because the thing is that the first reflex of someone is gonna first open a thread on the Twilight Struggle BGG page and say, why don't you make a game about this? And I will tell them, well, if you think there should be a game about this, why don't you stop sitting on your hands and start to get to work? So that's the first thing. And then once you have something that you're happy about, maybe give a call to Jason Carr. He's here. He's waiting for you. He's looking at you right now. Look at them. Look. And so that's an option. How do you see it, Jason? What's your vision for it?
Yeah, I mean, so you're absolutely right. I get so many free ideas. And honestly, like, they are useless to me. Like, I really appreciate people's excitement. And I'm always want to hear what people are thinking about, but my answer is always the same, which is, it sounds like you are really excited about this. You should make a game about it, because the person who's going to make the best game is the person who's the most excited about it. And we don't have, infinite time. Like, Jason and I don't have an infinite amount of time to spend designing Twilight Struggle games or any games. So for me, I've thought about some other topics that I might want to touch in the future. Right now, I'm really focused on getting Cuban Missile Crisis to be awesome. And if somebody else has ideas and time, I'm happy to give them a ton of my time to help get it right. But yeah, they need to bring me something that's playable and interesting and ready to go, because that's how we get the best games out of it. I think that the scale of Twilight Struggle can be messed with a lot. Like, I think if we continue to zoom in, you can find, not an infinite, but a very broad number of topics that haven't really been touched on that could be very interesting. I'm going to bite my tongue on any specifics so as not to give the game away. But I will say I think there's more in the fall of the Soviet Union that can be explored. And I think there's more in the, especially in the Middle East, that hasn't really been looked at. And so everything from let's zoom into a region to let's zoom into a specific moment, I think there's room for this engine to play, as long as you are using paranoia as kind of one of the backbones of what you're doing, and that kind of tension, escalation, and release. The system is going to work pretty well for it.
That's really interesting. I think I have an idea for you, but we'll talk about it offline. Great, but I think that's really interesting. Thanks for sharing all your thoughts. I have one last question before we end the stream tonight, and the question is something that came up, I think, quite a few times in different areas, coming from different people. A lot of people saw that you're starting to make a small series of Twilight Struggle game, and a lot of people said, well, aren't we have a series of focused Imperial Struggle games? And there was this discussion: can we expect the expansion of this game as a series, which is also maybe not as popular as Twilight Struggle because it's more recent, but is it something that you've been thinking about, Jason?
Yeah, I mean, from the get-go, I really wanted to do something that incorporated the Napoleonic Wars just with Imperial Struggle. And originally I had argued with Ananda that the Napoleonic Wars have to be in because Waterloo is the culmination of the British-French rivalry, essentially. But there is a real problem, and that problem is Trafalgar, because once Trafalgar happens during the Napoleonic Wars, the French are essentially unable to defend their colonial possessions. And the British go around picking them off one at a time very successfully. And of course, the French adopt the continental system as a way of kind of countering British imperialism. And that in itself is a very interesting conflict, but requires a somewhat different approach to the way imperial struggle works. That said, you know, there are other global or at least long-lasting rivalries that I think are very interesting. Obviously, the Prussians and the Austrians have this very long history of skirmishing with one another and jostling for control of the German states. I think part of the thing, though, is, you know, we designed imperial struggle really with war gamers in mind, because who the hell else is going to play something about the War of Austrian Succession? It's really the GMT core audience. And I do think that the system, the underlying system, would work in a lot of other contexts, as long as we sort of streamline it a bit, because that level of detail and complexity will not appeal as broadly.
Interesting. Great. But I would like to thank the both of you for your time. I think it was a really interesting conversation. I hope to have both of you back again once new issues or new releases in the Twilight Struggle series are going to be released, probably for Teach and Plays, because that's also a nice way for helping people to get their games on the table they've had it in Play 500, they get it at home. They remove the shrink wrap and then they don't play it. So having those sessions helps those games to be brought to the table. But it was a really interesting conversation. I really enjoyed that. So thanks to all of you. And I would like to thank people in the chat for all their interactions, but also at the end, all of their brilliant ideas about potential Twilight Struggle scenarios. I think my favorite is Joe Dewhurst, Twilight Struggle Cod Wars. There is actually a small print and play on BGG that I recommend that is really interesting. And I think it could actually make a quite funny little mini game. So I think there is definitely something like this. You know what, Joe? It could be an exercise to make it in 18 cards, something like this, and we could make it a button shy format. I think that could be really fun. I challenge you, Joe, to do it with me, and we can release it as a print and play. But that could be great. But it was awesome. Thanks again for all that. Thanks everyone for watching, and I guess I'm not sure what's the plan. Yes, the next stream is going to be this Sunday. We're going to finish the British Way End of Empire campaign. Stephen Ranganzas will be here. Joe Dewhurst will be here. And I will try to finally defeat him in Cyprus. So be here for the end of the campaign and the debrief. Thanks, everyone, and see you soon on Homo Ludens. Bye-bye.
Thanks.